In the heart of the ancient town of Blackwood, nestled among towering pines, there stood an abandoned mansion known to all as Hollow Manor. Its tall iron gates were rusted, its windows clouded with dust, and its towering, ivy-covered walls loomed over the quiet town like a dark secret. The mansion had been empty for as long as anyone could remember, but the villagers still whispered about it. They called it cursed, haunted by something far older and far more sinister than any ghost. The strangest tale about Hollow Manor involved its mirrors. It was said that in the cracked mirrors of the manor, a shadow could be seen, moving independently from its reflection. The shadow belonged to a woman who had lived there over a century ago, a woman named Catherine Holloway, who had vanished mysteriously one stormy night and was never seen again. Emma had grown up hearing the stories, though she had never believed them. She was a practical girl, and to her, the idea of a haunted mirror was more of a fairy tale than a real threat. She had always been fascinated by mysteries, and now, as a young woman in her 20s, her curiosity was stronger than ever. The town was small, and there was little excitement to be found, so when she and her friends dared each other to visit Hollow Manor, Emma couldn't resist. It was a crisp autumn evening when Emma finally approached the mansion, her breath visible in the cool air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town, and the forest surrounding the mansion seemed to whisper in the wind. Her friends had backed out at the last minute, but Emma, driven by a mix of curiosity and defiance, decided to go alone. The iron gate groaned loudly as she pushed it open, its hinges rusted from years of neglect. She stepped into the overgrown garden, where weeds had taken over and the stone path was barely visible. As she approached the front door, her heart began to race. The manor loomed above her, its towering windows like dark eyes watching her every move. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the heavy oak door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. The grand entrance hall was vast, with high ceilings and an elegant staircase leading to the upper floors. But everything was shrouded in shadows. The light from her lantern flickered as she stepped deeper into the house, illuminating the ghostly remnants of what had once been a grand estate. Dust-covered furniture, cobwebs hanging from chandeliers, and portraits of stern-looking ancestors stared down at her from the walls. As she explored further, she came across the mirrors. They were everywhere, tall, grand mirrors that lined the halls and rooms. Some were cracked, their surfaces fogged from years of disuse, but they all reflected the eerie, decaying beauty of the mansion. Emma walked past them cautiously, her eyes lingering on each one, half expecting to see something move in the glass that wasn't really there. And then it happened. She was in the grand ballroom, a massive room with vaulted ceilings and a chandelier that had long since lost its luster. At the far end of the room stood the largest mirror she had ever seen, its frame ornate and gilded, though tarnished by time. The glass was cracked down the middle, splitting the reflection in two. As Emma stepped closer, she felt a chill run down her spine. Her reflection looked back at her, but something was wrong. At first, it was subtle, a slight delay in the movement, as if the reflection was hesitating before mimicking her. She raised her hand to touch her face, and the reflection followed, but a moment too late. Emma's heart began to pound. She waved her hand again, more deliberately, and watched as her reflection copied her, again, with a noticeable delay. And then, just as she was about to step away, she saw it. The shadow. It was faint at first, just a dark blur at the edge of her reflection, but it was there. The shadow was not hers. It stood just behind her, watching. Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned quickly, expecting to see someone, or something, standing behind her in the room. But there was nothing. Only empty space. She turned back to the mirror, and her blood ran cold. The shadow in the reflection had moved. It was no longer behind her, it was standing directly beside her reflection, tall and menacing, though it had no defined form. It was darker than the shadows of the room, as if it were sucking the light from the space around it. Her reflection's eyes, still her own, flickered with something unfamiliar, something dark. And then the reflection smiled. Emma hadn't smiled, but the face in the mirror was grinning back at her with a wicked gleam. The shadow raised a hand, and her reflection followed, lifting its arm in a slow, deliberate motion. But it wasn't her arm, it was the shadow's. She could see the faint outline of it reaching through the glass. Emma stumbled back, her heart racing, but the shadow moved closer, pressing against the glass as if it were trying to break free. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and her breath formed small clouds in the air. She could feel the pull now, like invisible fingers wrapping around her wrist, tugging her toward the mirror. The reflection's mouth moved, though no sound came from it. But in her mind, she heard the whisper, "Come closer." Emma tried to turn and run, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The shadow's hand was reaching out of the mirror now, its cold, dark fingers brushing against her skin. Panic surged through her, and with a desperate cry, she yanked her arm away, stumbling backward into the room. The mirror cracked violently, a jagged line splitting the glass even further as the shadow retreated, vanishing into the depths of the mirror. The room grew silent once more, but Emma's heart was still pounding in her chest. She stood frozen, staring at the mirror, which now only reflected her pale, terrified face. The shadow was gone, but she knew it was still there, waiting. Without a second thought, she turned and fled from the mansion, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls as she bolted down the stairs and out the front door. She didn't stop running until she was back at the gate, gasping for breath. The sun had fully set, and the night was cold and dark around her. The villagers never spoke of Hollow Manor again after that night. Emma didn't tell anyone what had happened, but she avoided the mansion at all costs. And yet, no matter how hard she tried to forget, the memory of the shadow haunted her. Every time she passed by a mirror, any mirror, she couldn't help but glance, just for a moment, to make sure her reflection was truly her own. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world was quiet and she was alone, she swore she could still feel it, the shadow's cold fingers brushing against her skin, waiting for the moment when she would look too long. And deep down, she knew. One day, the shadow would return.